Okay, folks, so this is the final job pod for the Migration, Identity and Sovereignty unit for Paper 2, Human Geography, and this is focusing down on inquiry question 4 of that unit. So if we start off by returning to the pupil learning checklist, which is all linked to the spec, you can see there inquiry question 4, what are the threats to national sovereignty in a more globalized world? So this EQ4 tends to focus down onto the sovereignty part of the title of the unit. Again, though, referring back to this globalized world. Great synoptic links again to the globalization unit, as well as diverse places and as well to superpowers. So the key subsections of EQ4, as you can see here, you might have to turn your head, is 8B.10. National identity is an elusive and contested concept. So we explore that to begin with. Second part of the EQ4 is there are no challenges to national identity. And then finally, there are consequences for disunity within nations. So let's do a whistle-stop tour of EQ4. Now, again, as I always say, this is not a standalone revision resource. This goes alongside all of your other revision resources. Your class notes, obviously the most important. This is just a quick run through of what we did. I'm not reteaching anything here. So we started EQ4 with lesson 20, focusing on national identity. So let's remind ourselves of what we did here. So this is where we began. The objective to explain how nationalism, we covered nationalism in EQ2, but bringing it back here to explain how nationalism is enforced and understand how globalization means national identity and loyalty are complex. So we began by exploring in more depth, even though I'd introduced the term sovereignty to you in EQ1, what is sovereignty? If you want to return to that clip, go to the sixth form learning platform and click on the link. So we then linked in this idea of sovereignty and what it is to what does it mean to be British? And we had a discussion. What we spoke about originally was what do foreign people from other countries think about Britain and the identity of British? And here were some of the things that foreign people say about us, about the coastline, the countryside, particular types of food, the monarchy, tradition, and so on. And then we had this word wall. A survey was conducted, and these were all of the different elements that came across about what it means to have British identity. So there was this question, how do we support the idea of being British in our society? So we looked at particular ways that our British identity is portrayed through education, through sport and culture, and through politics, political parties. And I asked you, can you give me some examples? So in education, particular curriculum areas of history and citizenship have a role in creating our national British identity. In sport, through the Olympics, the World Cup, Eurovision is more cultural rather than sport. And then through political parties, different political parties will have different policies to reinforce particular British values. So we then focused down on a little example of the Olympics. And if you remember, showed you a clip of the 2012 Olympic Games in London, the opening ceremony, and how it was trying to portray and show the world about British identity. There was numerous clips there. So do watch those back. And then there was this task. How far do you think sport, politics, and education have actually shaped national identities? Not just Britain, but any country. So there was two tasks: explain how each can shape national identities, and secondly, make a judgment overall. What did you think? We then looked at how Britishness is portrayed internationally. is the image of Britain that's portrayed to other parts of the world actually accurate or not? And then how has British identity changed over time? So you created some notes on religious beliefs, food, identity, vocabulary, and why, all linked back to that overwhelming process of globalization. So I'll put this on the screen. So you just want to pause to remind yourself of London, which is the face of multinational Britain, and then some of the questions of national identity and loyalty. You can stop that now and have a look. A summary there of being British. There's some links for you to access to delve into this in more depth. So that was the first part of EQ4, particularly focusing on identity. That then led into a lesson on identity challenges. Now, let's get the right lesson here, which is this one here. And this was one of those lessons where you had to gather information, focusing on cultural cohesion and challenges to national identity. And here were the different areas that you needed to make some detailed notes on, which we then discussed the lesson after. So looking at cultural cohesion in the era of globalization, how English national identity has changed, and then looking at cultural cohesion and a comparison between the USA, the United Kingdom, and New Zealand. Second set of pages was looking at challenges to national identity, the Western power and influence over the global economic systems, a case study looking at the UK car industry, and that's a really good example of a loss of identity because the UK car industry waiting to decline. And then selection of 4 examples of non-UK car brands, their locations, products, and who actually now owns them. And to finish off, some notes on Westernization and Americanization, and then examples of Walt Disney, MTV, and Apple. Make sure you return to your detailed notes on those. So that was the second lesson of EQ4, which led in nicely to lesson 22, which is all about foreign ownership. Let's remind ourselves of what we did here. So, does foreign ownership of property threaten national identity, where companies from abroad buy up companies from our country, if you like? And the objective here was to understand why foreign ownership of property can cause issues, but also brings advantages as well. And if you remember, we looked at the example of the Shard here, where 95% of the Shard is owned by the state of Qatar, and only 5% is actually British owned. We spoke about the SWF, what is the Sovereign Wealth Fund as well. Remind yourself of that by pausing there if you wish. We then looked at some data, looking at the background to the UK housing crisis and what story do these 2 graphs tell us of housing in the UK, and link that then into who is buying London properties. So there were some articles here about the invasion of the property snatchers, where foreign foreign people were buying up property in London, for example, and where they were from, why they were buying them. There's a really good article that you read through and made some notes on why an influx of foreign money is good for the London property market. And then there was this example of the tower at St George's Wharf in central London, where we looked at the different types of people from different countries who own property within this one particular tower. Just remind yourself of some of those examples by pausing now if you wish. And then, is there a solution? So we looked at different countries about what they've done to try and restrict foreign ownership of property, for example, in Switzerland, limiting on the number of secondary residences in any municipality of 20%. Singapore, and Denmark. So 3 good examples there of countries that have tried to put in solutions to the problem of foreign property ownership. And that led into a really nice reading article on Sadiq Khan's plan for London. Did you agree? Why and why not? So that was the second lesson of EQ4, sorry, the third lesson, which led into, again, another good synoptic link back to EQ2, which was looking at nationalist movements. So let's explore as a reminder what we did here. So this was in particular looking at nationalist movements creating disunity within nations. So what are the threats to national sovereignty in a more globalized world is your EQ4, and in particular now looking at examples of nationalist movements and their aims. Looked at these 4 key terms and 5 key terms. What is autonomous? What is devolution? What is pluralistic, secession, and separatist? And then looked at 10 countries that may not survive another 20 years. Which ones do you think they are? We had a discussion on that, which led into 2 case studies. One of Scotland within the United Kingdom, which is called, there's been calls over the years for Scotland to become an independent nation state and break away from the political union of the United Kingdom. And the other one was Catalonia in Spain. 2 really good examples that you'd have put together as case studies. The first one was Catalonia. You had resources to use alongside extra research. A bit more on Catalonia, you put together a timeline. And then Scotland. The Scotland in the United Kingdom debate, if Scotland were to split from the UK, what would the impacts be? And why is Scotland, or some people in Scotland, calling for the independence of Scotland as its own nation state? So that leads us into the final lesson of EQ4. What are the consequences of disunity within nations? And this is where we looked in particular at fragile states. We looked at these words. What does it mean to be a failed state? What's a crisis? What's a stable state? What's a fragile? What's resilience? And here's the key bit: to be able to assess the fragility of a country, and then to understand the impact of disunity within a country, in this case resulting in what we call a failed fragile state. That's where we began. What is a failed fragile state? We defined it, characterized by loss of control of its territory, erosion of authority, inability to provide public services, and then the inability to interact with other states effectively. We looked at the world's most fragile states through the Fragile States Index. Remind yourself of that, please. Again, a bit more on the Fragile States Index. We looked at the 4 different areas, which then broken down into 12 criteria to assess the fragility of states. Some of the criticisms we explored as well. I threw these 2 slides in here, referring back to something we mentioned in superpowers, a good synoptic link here, looking at the power of the passport. So these ones here are the world's most restricted nations. Maybe some of these are classed as fragile, failed states, which means your passport doesn't have much power. Which led into your final case study example. To what extent is Somalia a failed state? Looking at Somalia and looking at what's gone on. Why is it a failed state? What has happened in Somalia? So that rounds off very nicely our EQ4. So if we return to the sub-questions, as you'll see, it covered national identity as an elusive and contested concept. There are no challenges to national identity, looking at westernization and so on. And then finally, there are consequences to disunity within nations. So that rounds off the summary jog pod for EQ4 of migration, identity and sovereignty.